Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning still to you on the West Coast. My name is Steve Teutsch, and I'm the chair of this committee. I want to welcome everyone to the third meeting of the Committee on Health Effects and Patterns of Use of Premium Cigars of the National Academies. This study is sponsored by the Center for Tobacco Products at the FDA and the NIH. Today, I'm joined by committee members who are also participating virtually. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves individually in just a moment. But before we do, I want to note that this is an open, on-the-record session. Interested individuals have been invited to attend as observers via Zoom. I'd also like to make sure everyone is aware that this is an information gathering session. And as such, the committee is in the process of assembling materials that it will examine and discuss in the course of making its findings, conclusions, and recommendations. So be extremely mindful of the fact that the committee has made no conclusions, and that would be a mistake for anyone to leave here today thinking otherwise. Comments made by individuals, including members of the committee, should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or of the National Academies. In addition, committee members often ask probing questions, and the questions they ask may not be indicative of their personal views. We anticipate the report to be released in March of next year. And between now and then, the committee will be deliberating and then be drafting its report. Once that report is written, it goes through a rigorous review by experts who are anonymous to the committee, and then gets final revisions from the committee itself. This is the fourth information gathering session and will include presentations and discussions on a variety of topics to allow the committee to gather the information it needs. In addition to the presentations we'll hear today, the committee has reviewed information relevant to its charge and will continue to gather additional information over the course of the study. Meeting information is available on the project website. After the speakers have completed their comments, there'll be a question and answer period from the committee. And at the end of the meeting, we will invite comments from the public as time allows. I realize that we're abutting against the Memorial Day weekend, so we'll try to keep on track. You may submit questions or comments via the Q&A box, and staff will read them aloud. We will, of course, only be addressing comments and questions that are relevant to today's presentations and our statement of task. Just so you're aware, speakers have been asked to disclose whether they receive any funding for related activities and the sources of such funding. The meeting is being webcast live and being recorded. The presentations and videos will be posted to the project website 1 or 2 weeks after the meeting. So now I'd like the committee members to briefly introduce themselves with their name and affiliations. For those of you who would like more detail, there are brief bios of all the committee members online. So let me begin. As I said, my name is Steve Teutsch. I'm at the UCLA and the University of Southern California. And let me now ask Bao. Wei, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, this is Wei Bao, Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Iowa.
And Neil?
I'm Neil Benowitz, Professor of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco.
Good. Chris?
Hi, Christine Del Nevo, Professor at Rutgers University.
And Pebbles?
Pebbles Fagan from the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences.
Maciej?
Maciej Goniewicz, Professor of Oncology at Russell Park Cancer Center.
And Steve Hecht?
Steve Hecht, Professor at the University of Minnesota.
Good. Miranda?
Hello, I'm Miranda Jones, Assistant Professor of Epidemiology at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health.
And Grace?
Hello, my name is Grace Kong. I'm Assistant Professor at Yale School of Medicine.
Adam, are you there?
Yeah, I can't start my video. Adam Leventhal, University of Southern California.
Darren?
I'm Darren Mays. I'm an associate professor at Ohio State University.
Rafael?
I am Rafael Mesa, associate professor and associate chair of the Department of Epidemiology, University of Michigan.
Kim?
Hi, I'm unable to start my video. Kim Sterling, associate professor of at the University of Texas School of Public Health.
Good. And Andrea?
Andrea Valenti, associate professor at the University of Vermont.
Excellent. So we have our full complement of committee members today. And now I'd like to introduce our first panel, which will focus on tobacco product chemistry and science. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Cliff Watson, who is the director of the Tobacco Products Laboratory at CDC. Then, assuming that he can, his schedule will allow him to be here quickly, we'll hear from Ben Blunt, research chemist also at CDC, and then from Dr. Bartosz Kozłowski, who is the division manager of individual and population health at Battelle. Following those presentations, as I said, we'll open it up to Q&A from the committee. So let's begin. Dr. Watson, let's hear what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Cliff Watson. I'm giving a talk today on my thoughts towards harmonization of machine testing for measuring mainstream smoke constituents of premium cigars. I apologize if this is a review of material you've already heard before, but hopefully I can make this somewhat interesting and informative and at least give you my spin on things. Next slide, please. A standard disclaimer. Anything I say today is not an official position of the Centers for Disease Control. These are my own sort of thoughts and comments. Next slide, please. Quick outline here. Review cigar classifications, at least that we use in my laboratory. We'll talk about how mainstream smoke is generated for chemical analysis, the available guidance on machine testing for measuring mainstream smoke from cigars. So how some of the parameters impact the mainstream smoke deliveries. As you probably know, when you measure mainstream smoke with these commercial smoking machines, the mainstream smoke is divided into two phases: the so-called particulate matter, which is normally the tar or total particulate matter, which is captured on a glass fiber filter pad. And we have methods for analyzing these things for like nicotine, tobacco nitrosamines, metals, pHs, aromatic amines, phenols, menthol, humectants, HCN, and a host of other things. And then the constituents that are volatile, which pass through that glass fiber pad, are the so-called vapor phase constituents. And these generally are things that we measure in our laboratory: carbon monoxide, the various carbonyls, and the various VOCs. So one of the things I'd really like to highlight is some of the sort of shortcomings of the available guidance on mainstream cigarette smoking for large cigars. And sort of steps we could do to harmonize the intra and inter-laboratory comparison of various studies or papers that have been published looking at the delivery of these large cigars. Then briefly touch on topography, because as everyone knows, machine smoking doesn't really reflect what people actually get. Machine smoking is more useful for making product comparisons. Talk about topography measurements, about how people actually use the products. And then a subsequent talk today by Dr. Blunt, if he can join us. If not, I'll cover his talk on sort of biomarker measurements. And then we'll summarize sort of what I went over today. Next slide, please. So analyzing cigars is challenging because cigars come in many sizes and shapes. Different diameters, different weights, different tobacco. Normally these are air cured or fermented tobaccos. They have different shapes. The tip of the cigar can be different. That can be sort of pointy or torpedo shaped versus sort of round. The uniformity of the outside wrapper can vary depending on how they're made, whether they're machine made or hand rolled. And so it's much more challenging than measuring things like cigarettes or little cigars, which are very much uniform in size, shape, and are very easy to do, to measure under machine smoking conditions. Next slide, please. So today we're really going to focus on these large cigars, of which the premium cigars would be a category of, and they do present some unique challenges for making analytical measurements. It's not difficult to do it, but there are some special nuances that one has to be aware of. They do require a different holder than cigarettes or the small cigars, but that technology does exist and it works fairly well. Next slide, please. So quickly, one of the things I was asked to do was define the cigar definitions. This is sort of an issue that there aren't, to my knowledge, official designations for different types of cigars. That slide I put up with a different size where I was saying, you know, little cigars, cigarillos, large cigars, it's just the terminology we use in-house. There is a federal law, section 5702 of the Title 26 of the United States Code, which defines tobacco products as cigars, cigarettes, smokeless tobacco, pipe tobacco, and roll your own tobacco. And within the cigar category, there are two types. There are small cigars and large cigars. And this is largely based on the mass per stick or mass per cigar. And if you're interested in this, this is hosted on the TTB website, and I have the link below there. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to delve too deeply into the type of chemicals we measure. I mean, basically, if you're burning organic, tobacco mass, you would expect you would get similar chemicals as other combustible tobacco products, and that indeed is the case. So here we see a comparison. This is out of the monograph 9, the NIH monograph, and I believe these are data from Bruneman and Hoffman from 1997. Not there's anything special about this data set, but it illustrates a point I want to make very nicely. You can see, like, if you want to compare, we have a lot more data on cigarettes than we do on cigars, because cigarettes are, more widely used, plus they're more uniform and they're easier to measure. So we're going to make a little comparison here between the non-filtered cigarettes and the large premium cigars. Next slide, please. So if you look at these data, or at least I do, kind of just grossly, and you look at sort of, okay, we're going to compare the Pall Mall non-filtered cigarette. This is would be the most comparable thing to a cigar, since it's not filtered. Most cigars, large cigars, aren't filtered. And look at the, I've highlighted here a couple of categories. If you look at the weight, you see that basically the large premium cigar has about 8 times the mass. I mean, this is take it with a grain of salt, because that could vary depending on the cigar and the type of cigar and the size of the cigar. But for this data set, it's about 8 times as large. And then if you scan down the columns, you say we're looking at comparing maybe nicotine, benzoapyrene, and the carcinogenic tobacco nitrosamines in an N and K. And we can see, okay, we have an 8x increase in mass. We have a 4 to 7 increase in the mainstream smoke deliveries of these constituents. And so it would appear that, perhaps weight is kind of a guiding factor in determining, what the, deliveries would be. They're the similar deliveries, do you get more or less compared to other products? And that's what we're getting at. So that seems to correlate. But next slide. And we sort of delve deeper and we see, okay, these are the same data set. We look at tar, and tar has long been a surrogate for sort of harmful things in mainstream tobacco smoke. And we're only seeing about a 2x increase. So obviously weight is not the only thing, affecting the different deliveries among the cigarette tobacco, or sorry, among the different tobacco product types. And that makes perfectly sense for anyone that does this work. They're sitting in their chairs going, Cliff, what are you doing? You're comparing apples and oranges here, and I am comparing apples and oranges. There are different protocols for generating mainstream smoke from cigarettes than there are from cigars. And that's what I want to sort of touch on, because how you machine smoke these products will have a large impact on the measured deliveries. Next slide, please. So a large cigar smoking machine, this is a picture of one here in the background of my laboratory. It's made by a commercial company. It looks, on the right-hand side, there are cigarette smoking machines, and on the left-hand side, there is an e-cigarette smoking machine. But if you compare, it looks basically, it's a 20-port linear machine. You can smoke 20, in this case, cigars at the same time. It looks to the eye in this photograph as the same as a cigarette smoking machine, but it's a little bit different. The holders are a little bit different. The machine's a little bit deeper to accommodate the longer length of the smoking article, so that the side stream smoke goes up into, vented out through the lab. So the operator that's running these tests, is never exposed to secondhand smoke or secondary smoke. There are no ISO standards like for cigarette smoking. For cigarette smoking, there's many ISO standards that determine how the cigarettes are prepared and conditioned and smoked and analyzed, mainly for tar, nicotine, and carbon monoxide. There are not ISO standards for cigar smoke. There are Cresta methods, and so Cresta is a work group that basically tries to help develop uniform protocols so we can have inter-laboratory comparisons. And Crest also runs a variety of round-robin testing, which they have done for cigars too. I'll touch on that in a minute. But I list here a screenshot of sort of the available guidance in terms of how you condition the cigarettes, how you sample the cigars, the conditions for the machine smoking, and then some measurements for how you measure tar, which they've nicotine-free dry particulate matter, and how you measure mainstream smoke nicotine, how you measure water, and how you measure carbon monoxide. And you need to measure water because you measure total particulate matter, and you need water and nicotine subtract from total particulate matter to give you the tar value. Next slide, please. So there are some guidance. They're not ISO standards, but there are guidance. But there's some things in the guidance under the Crest that are kind of loosely defined, at least to my mind. And one of these impact the deliveries and how you measure the products and how you measure the mainstream smoke deliveries. One of them is airflow. And so, I mean, clearly, when you're actively smoking the cigars, there's a syringe pump which draws a fixed volume of air through the cigar to collect the smoke from that puff. But in between, when it's in the static burn mode, you have to have some airflow coming in the front of the machine to sweep away that sort of, static burning sort of secondhand smoke that's coming off the products. So that has to be balanced fairly carefully, because if it's too low, it'll come out into the chamber and you'll expose your operator. And if you crank that up too much to get very high flow, it then basically you increase what's called the static burn rate. So basically that extra airflow makes the cigarettes burn too fast. So that would drive down the measured deliveries. Also, there's some challenges in terms of leak checking. It seems the products aren't uniform, and tip cutting, how you cut the tips, the smoking regimen, which differs from other products. There's some issues with self-ignition. What do you do if the product goes out during a smoking run? And then parameter recordings, which are the most important parameters to record. Next slide. I'm watching the time here and I see I'm running out very quickly. So the airflow characterization is very nebulous. Basically, it says you have to have a stable 10 centimeters side stream smoke coming off from the product. In my mind, this is a fairly subjective recommendation. It's highly influenced by things in the surrounding environment. If someone walking in the chamber, it'll impact the smoke flow. And this is different from cigarettes. In cigarettes, basically, there's a specification of what the airflow should be. And so one of the recommendations I would have would be, once you achieve the stable 10 centimeters airstream, side stream smoke column, that you then measure that the air velocity so that you can reproduce it as needed. Next slide, please. Leak checking is very important. Here we've got one exploded layout, I'll say exploded diagram. It's actually pictures of the Cambridge filter pad holders that hold the large cigar. And that little arrow is pointing to something called a bobbin, which has a latex sleeve inside that. And the way the sealing works is you install these parts together. The cigar inserts through the hole in the middle, goes through this little bobbin, and you open the bobbin by applying a vacuum to it, which causes it to open, release the vacuum, and then the latex sleeve inside the green bobbin closes down. And then if you look at the picture over here on the right, there's a whole set of these different bobbins to accommodate the different sizes. And so it's fairly cumbersome. So, you select these based on the products you're testing. It works well, it seals fairly well, but there's not a commercial test device like a virtual cigar that you can plug into these to test the actual leaks. Now, there are other indirect ways you can test this. You check the puff profiles and the flow rates, and you make sure those are correct. But this is a weakness in my opinion. Next slide, please. Another thing for the premium cigars, they're closed on the end, they're wrapped. And so you have to cut them to pull smoke through them. And this is what the consumer normally does. The bottom slide shows two conventional holders. There's a third style called a punch, which I didn't have a picture of. But there's so-called V-shape, which you basically have the little cutter, which cuts the V-shape, or you can do a circular cut. So these things aren't specified either in any of the protocols about where you make the cut, how deep you make the cut, and whether or not that actually makes a difference on the mainstream smoking has not been studied thoroughly, in my opinion. We need to know, does that actually make a difference? Does the diameter of the cut really impact the airflow down the rod, which then in turn impacts the mainstream smoke deliveries? So generally what we try to do is mimic what actual smokers do, cigar smokers. Next slide, please. I'm running out of time here, I see. So I want to very briefly cover the smoking regimen, which is different from cigarette smoking. Those of you that are in the know that you have a standard puff duration, puff interval, and puff volume based on what smoking regimen you're using. For cigars, it's a little bit different. So the puff duration is a little bit shorter. The puff interval is a little bit shorter or longer, depending on which regimen you're talking about compared to cigarettes. But the diameter depends on the diameter of the cigar itself. And this was designed with the thought behind this was that you would keep the airflow constant in the cigar regardless of the diameter. But that does make it different from how you smoke cigarettes. So making direct comparisons is challenging sometimes because you're actually smoking the products differently is the main point I want to make here. Next slide, please. So there's, in my opinion, there's several things you could do to help harmonize reporting of data between lab studies or for papers so that you could make better comparison of different data sets. One thing is, I've already mentioned, the airflow checks. Once you've achieved the static 10 centimeter column of the side stream smoke plume, it would be to record the air velocity. And so it'd be much easier to come back and hit that reproducible target. Leak checking is very important. And one thing I like to propose is it'd be very easy these days to create a virtual premium cigar with a fixed pressure drop using 3D printing or other technologies. And then we could verify that the leak check was adequate instead of using these sort of secondary methods we're using right now. Another thing we need to look at, in my opinion, is the tip cutting. So basically just recording the type and the depth of the cut. Optionally, there are devices where you can measure pressure drop through the tobacco column, and it might be good if you have one of those devices to measure that too, so you knew what the pressure drop was after the cut and report that along with the date as well. And then if the cigar itself extinguishes during the smoking run, if you feel the need to relight it or basically just see that as a QC failure, record how this was accomplished, because that could make a difference. If you like, say, for instance, normally you light these things with a resistive electric heater, but if you were to light them with a butane torch, that might influence the VOC levels you're measuring. And so the key thing, though, here is in data reporting, and this is, again, my opinion, sort of optimized cross-study comparisons. It would be good to record things like the mass of the cigar before and after smoking, record the puff count so we know what the total smoke volume was. You could then report the data on a per mass of tobacco smoked or per unit volume basis. And again, I think this would ease comparison between studies so we can make better inter-study comparisons. Next slide, please. I am out of time. I'm over time right now. So basically, just wanted to reemphasize that machine testing does not tell you much in the way of how people actually use the product. There are better ways to get at that. What machine testing is good for is for doing product comparisons to see how product A compares to product B, or how the different parameters in terms of the cut or the wrapper porosity or the type of tobacco, how that influences the overall delivery. To get more on how people use the products, there's a variety of topography type measurements that one can do. And these include sort of observation filming using pressure transducers where you're smoking the cigar in a device which measures the pressure drop, which then you can record electronically puff count, duration, puff interval, volume. All of these have pros and cons. One of the things we do in our laboratory is the filter bud analysis. We look at discarded cigarette filter buds, but of course that doesn't work on cigars. It works great on little cigars, and we have some publications coming out on this, but it does not really apply to large filtered cigars. Next slide, please. So there are limitations of the topography measurements as well. I won't read the slide to you because I am out of time. But what I wanted to say is while cigar topography will give you insights on behavior, it does not directly measure exposure. And to, basically to better measure exposure, you need to do biomarker assessment. Next slide, please. So I'll skip the summary since we're out of time. Everyone has access to slides and can read these. And I'll say thank you very much and happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Right. Thanks so much, Dr. Watson. And then let me see, Dr. Blount, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. I'm delighted. We were uncertain as to the timing of this. So you're here right on time. And let me turn it over to you for your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction. And Cliff, thank you for the 1-2 punch here for this presentation, really setting up the topic that I'll be talking about, that being biomarkers. Let me pull these slides up. Okay, so as I was saying, my presentation will focus on biomarkers. I'm the chief of the Tobacco and Volatile branch, and I have no financial conflicts of interest to declare. Also just wanted to say that the findings and conclusions of this presentation are mine and do not necessarily represent the official position of CDC. Furthermore, if I mention any trade names or commercial sources, I'm simply doing that for identification and not blessing those sources. So as Dr. Watson was talking about, the tobacco health continuum is very important to define so that we can understand how tobacco products cause disease. And perhaps importantly to this moment of history we're in right now, how regulatory intervention, how effective that is at reducing population harm. So again, fortunately for me, Dr. Watson did a great job talking about the Tobacco Products Lab and characterization of premium cigars, their emissions, and also topography. Cliff, thank you for covering those last 2 slides, because I think topography, or the understanding of how people are actually using the products, is very important. And so it's good to have that coverage. What I'll be talking about today are the second half of the CDC tobacco laboratory, and that's the biomonitoring measurement. So we are measuring tobacco and tobacco smoke-related chemicals in people's bodies, in serum, blood, urine, saliva, other tissues. Also, in some cases, looking at markers of potential harm in an effort to connect the dots along this tobacco health effect continuum and better understand, very importantly, exposure and how that changes with changes in the product marketplace and changes in behaviors, and how those things impact disease risk. So with biomarkers of exposure to tobacco and smoke, these are valuable for documenting uptake of nicotine intoxicants from cigar smoke, and really much more precise than just a number of puffs or a number of cigars smoked, because different individuals smoke in different ways. And so biomarkers provide insights about product use intensity, and importantly, these days, about co- and dual use of tobacco and cannabis products. More on that in a couple slides. Importantly, biomarkers can also provide a measure of internal dose, such that an exposure to a tobacco smoke toxicant can be compared with a toxicological benchmark, such as a reference dose, to better understand and compare and contrast relative harm caused by different chemical species. Lastly, biomarkers are a quantitative measure against which intervention efficacy can be evaluated. So very quickly, I want to talk about a couple conceptual slides before we get into the data on premium cigars that's in the literature, especially that population representative data. The first concept is to talk about biomarker patterns to differentiate between different tobacco product use. And here you can see across the top of this table different categories, and I just want to focus on the users today. And then vertically, different assays or different analyte screens, classes of addictants, nicotine, either measured in serum or urine, and then a number of different harmful chemicals, tobacco-specific nitrosamines, mainly NNAL, the metabolite of N and K, harmful metals, VOCs such as the acrylonitrile metabolite, cyanoethyl mercapturic acid, PAHs, aromatic amines, carboxyhemoglobin. And lastly, because we're talking about cigars, I do just want to mention urinary cannabinoids and the fact that some cigar products tend to be hollowed out, the tobacco replaced with cannabis, and that product smoked. But of course, for premium cigars, that's much less the case. And I just, with this graphic, want to highlight those first two columns of pink and green, where you see high exposure levels to so many of these harmful and addictive constituents from both premium cigars and from cigarettes. Another concept to pay close attention to are the kinetics of the biomarkers and the importance of looking at the biomarker, understanding the appropriate kinetics, and those tend to change whether you're talking about a parent chemical, for example, benzene, measured typically in blood or urine or breath, or you're measuring a metabolite, for example, trans-muconic acid, a metabolite of benzene that can be measured predominantly in the urine. Furthermore, adducts have a longer half-life. Here in this stylized graphic, you can see that x-axis is log 10 scale, and the blood, especially blood VOCs, being cleared very quickly as compared with hemoglobin addicts, for example, that can last for up to 4 months because of the half-life of the hemoglobin they're attached to. So important to consider the half-lives. Lastly, I'll just say that just because something is a urinary metabolite, for example, doesn't mean that it fits this stylized pattern. For example, nicotine is cleared with a excretion half-life of just over an hour. Conversely, nicotine metabolites such as cotinine around 3/4 of a day, NNAL a half-life of 3 or 4 weeks, and urinary cadmium can stick around really for years because it's partitioning in other tissues. And so it's very important to consider that when you're considering interpretation of the biomarker data. Lastly, on interpretation, just as so this graphic from Lisa Aylward et al. In work that was done about a decade ago, but still very timely, where it shows the relationship of excretion half-life, or HL, and the exposure interval, or tau. And that ratio of HL to tau results in how stable the biomarker levels will be with the episodic exposure and variable time between exposure. So if you're trying to look at a short half-life biomarker such as nicotine in someone who's an intermittent tobacco product user, those levels are going to vary dramatically as compared to an everyday user of products and looking at a long-term, a long-lived biomarker such as NNAL. So I make this point just to draw a little bit of a contrast between NHANES data and PATH data, where for NHANES, study participants travel to a mobile exam center where their blood and urine is collected. That mobile exam center is a smoke-free zone, and so individuals have a forced abstinence period of 2 to 3 hours typically before their blood or urine is collected. Conversely, the PATH study involves a study staff member going to the study participant's home and collecting the biological specimen at their home, where presumably they could even be smoking a cigarette while they're collecting their biological specimens. So that time of last use does tend to be a bit shorter in PATH, and that does affect short-lived biomarkers of exposures in those two studies. So shifting gears from theory to practice, I'd like to highlight two papers done on US population that are population representative studies, one in INHANES, one in PATH, both published in CEBP by FDA Center for Tobacco Products staff. I think both are useful to our discussion today. A little bit of information about INHANES. This is a CDC survey that's designed to collect data on the health and nutritional status on the US population. It samples a representative sample of the US population based on age, sex, race, ethnicity, and income. Very importantly, I want to highlight that cigar smoking is not one of the selection criteria. It's also not designed to be representative of that. So as we're talking about the cigar data in INHANES, you'll find me referring to the fact that this is a representative sample of the US population, but a relatively small N of premium cigar users. Also, just to highlight that INHANES has been continuous since 1999 in 2-year cycles. Some of you are probably also familiar with the CDC's National Exposure Report and the fact that we include a smoking categorization. I just want to be totally clear about that. Even though many of these chemicals, such as the one I show in this graphic, the cyanoethyl mercapturic acid, are very useful at distinguishing between smokers and non-smokers. These tables are derived solely from cigarette smoker data, exclusive cigarette smoker data, and therefore are not highly relevant to our discussion today. So a caveat there. Nonetheless, INHANES includes many tobacco-related biomarkers, whether we're talking about serum, cotinine, and hydroxycotinine, or urinary nicotine metabolites, urinary anandamide and anabasine, a number of different smoke constituents, tobacco-specific nitrosamines, harmful metals, including cadmium and lead, also arsenic. In a number of subsets, we're measuring albumin adducts of aldehydes, as well as hemoglobin adducts of ethylene oxide, acrylonitrile, and several other electrophilic constituents of tobacco smoke. Also, serum HSTRP. So it's really a wealth of information. Having said that, it's a cross-sectional study design. Not all of these analytes are measured in all INHANES cycles, and they're not measured in all INHANES study participants. In fact, many of these are measured in a 1/3 environmental subsample. The special smoker subsample, unfortunately, is also only cigarette smokers, and in large part that's because of the relatively small N for tobacco use categories other than cigarettes for INHANES. So some conclusions from the first paper that I'd like to refer to, and that's Chen et al. And their paper looking at INHANES data 1999 to 2002, looking at biomarkers of exposure for US cigar smokers. The data that I'll be talking about are, I'll be focusing in on cotinine and NNAL biomarker levels. So very consistent finding that non-daily cigar smokers had lower levels of exposure biomarkers than daily cigar smokers. Also, quite expectedly, for cotinine and NNAL, these are highly selective for tobacco and tobacco smoke exposure. So non-smokers had very low levels relative to daily cigarette-only or daily cigar-only smokers, as well as dual users of cigars and cigarettes. Biomarkers increased with increasing number of cigars smoked per day. And also for daily users, they found that primary cigar smokers or cigar smokers who had not formerly been cigarette smokers are lower. The biomarker levels for cotinine and NNA levels were lower than in secondary cigarettes or cigar smokers. In other words, current exclusive premium cigar smokers who formerly smoked cigarettes. The same pattern was found in non-daily users as well. Lastly, just a couple caveats about this paper. There was no distinction between premium cigars, cigarillos, and little filtered cigars because the INES questionnaires at the time did not distinguish between those very different products. I didn't talk about the cadmium and arsenic findings because they're explainable by, in the first case for cadmium, by kinetics, and in the second case for arsenic, there was no relationship to product use, primarily because of dietary sources of organic arsenic. Lastly, data are pooled over a 14-year period to get enough cigar smokers to be able to draw some conclusions, but perhaps these products are changing with time, and thus this complicates the interpretation of the results. Next, I'd like to talk about the study by Dr. Chang et al. That came out just a year and a half ago, data from the Population Assessment of Tobacco and Health, or PATH study, which you are all very familiar with. Because it's from the PATH study, where PATH is designed to take a representative sample of the U.S. population, and selection criteria include tobacco product use. There is more information in PATH about different types of product use, including the exclusive cigar smokers that were targeted for this wave 1 of PATH analysis. I do want to point out that in the paper, there's a grouping of all types of cigars for some tables, and then a stratification based on premium cigars, cigarillos, and little filtered cigars. The data presented are all urinary biomarkers from a single spot urine, and the analyzed biomarkers of exposure that I'll talk about are nicotine, TSNAs, metals, pHs, and VOCs. So for the findings for the study, similar to INES, never users much lower than some days cigar-only smokers, which are lower than everyday cigar smokers. Those everyday cigar smokers also had lower TNE2, which is the molar sum of cotinine and hydroxycotinine, the two primary metabolites of nicotine. And that is compared to everyday cigarette-only smokers. The geometric mean ratio was just a little short. I think it was, it was 1.9. Dual cigarette smokers were more similar to cigarette smokers. And I do just want to highlight that these findings are similar to the findings from the MESA study. Also, in the Chang et al. Paper, other biomarkers tend to be lower in everyday premium cigar users versus everyday cigarette smokers, but the difference often did not reach significance in many cases for many of these biomarkers because of the small n for the premium cigar smokers. I will just add that the geometric means for NNAL and most smoke biomarkers for everyday cigarette smokers were approximately double that of everyday premium cigar smokers. So even though that often didn't reach statistical significance, I think I want to highlight that the geometric mean ratio tended to be around 2. Lastly, for this study, dual users had biomarker levels more like cigar smokers than, more like cigarette smokers than cigar smokers. Also, certainly this moniker has been been used by some on the panel, and I think it's very fitting here, of close but no cigar, where the everyday filtered cigar-only smokers had the highest levels of biomarker concentrations compared to certainly higher than premium cigar users and also cigarillo-only smokers. The rank order of the nicotine and smoke toxicant biomarkers tended to be lowest among cigarillo smokers, followed by premium cigar smokers, followed by filtered cigar smokers who were fairly similar to those cigarette smokers. And in parentheses there, I show the N for those categories for the smoke exposure biomarkers. So increasing exposure to nicotine, NK, acrylonitrile, and acrolein was also found with increasing numbers of cigars smoked per day, similar to the NHANES results. So in summary, the levels of exposure biomarkers are consistently higher in daily cigar smokers, daily premium cigar smokers, compared with cigarette smokers, daily levels are higher compared with non-daily. Secondly, biomarker levels increase with increasing numbers of cigars smoked per day. Nicotine and smoke toxicant levels are consistently higher in everyday smokers compared to never users, and that premium cigar smokers tended to have higher exposure biomarker levels compared to cigarillo smokers, but lower levels compared to cigarette smokers and filtered cigar users. Although these differences did not reach statistical significance in many cases because of the small n for the premium cigar smokers. So that leads me to my final statement that additional data would be useful to better characterize cigar-related exposures in the U.S. population. So with that, I'm out of time, but I welcome clarifying questions at the appropriate time. Thank you for your attention.
Right, thank you. Next, let's turn to Dr. Kozlowski.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting. Today I want to talk a little bit about nicotine pharmacokinetics and puffing behaviors of large cigar smokers. Here is a summary of research support. I'm going to present two studies. One study was funded by Food and Drug Administration as a contract to Battelle, and the other one was funded by National Cancer Institute as a R01 grant. I have no conflict of interest to report. So a little bit of background. Clive and Ben provide a very nice overview already, but just to provide some additional information, cigar smoking is associated with nicotine addiction and adverse health effects, including mouth and throat cancer, similar to, and they deliver similar toxicant as you can find in cigar smoke, which was very nicely covered already. And unlike cigarettes that are quite uniform in size and composition, there is a wide range of cigar sizes, flavors, and designs. And Cliff showed a very nice picture with all the different sizes of cigar products. So as you could see, they differ very much in design. And also, because there is no naming standards, manufacturers are free to label cigars as they wish, typically define them as little cigars, cigarillos, large cigars, or premium cigars. And premium cigars are considered to be a subcategory of large cigars. Premium cigars are, instead of being machine-made, they are handmade. One thing I want to mention today, I'm going to talk about, is that subset of cigar smokers, specifically large cigar, premium cigar users, tend to not to inhale smoke, which may differentiate this product's use behavior from other combustible tobacco products. And I have two studies where we were investigating if it's actually true and how the toxicant exposure looks from those products. So I'm going to discuss two studies. I'm not able to provide a lot of information about study design, inclusion, exclusion criteria, and how exactly we conducted the studies and all the measures we collected. They are pretty large, but I'm going to present a subset of results that I'm hoping that are going to be interesting and informative to the committee. In the first study, we focus on large cigar users, and we let the participant use the products ad lib. It means that they came to the clinic, they were provided a large cigar product and they smoke it as they usually would in their regular setting. And the second study I'm going to discuss was designed to investigate the impact of cigar tobacco pH, either low or high, on nicotine pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, subjective measures after BACO, means mouth absorption, by experimentally controlling smoking behavior to limit smoke inhalation. And this study was modeled after the subset of cigar smokers that tend not to inhale smoke. Let's start with the study number, the first study. So ad libitum use of large cigars. The population was not very large. We recruited 17 participants. They are mostly men. 77% were African American. And as I said, they were asked to use either cigarette or large cigar product ad libitum in 2 laboratory sessions. So they came to our clinic. We provided them with either cigarette or cigar product, and they smoked them. We measure plasma, nicotine, and exhaled carbon monoxide before and after smoking. And we also measured smoking topography measures throughout the smoking session. So puff volume, puff duration, puff velocity, inter-puff interval, etc. Here are some results. As you can see in this table, both cigarettes and large cigars significantly increase plasma nicotine and carbon monoxide, and also significantly decrease the urge to smoke. Those data are not presented here. So starting point, pre-smoking was pretty similar, and post-smoking was also pretty similar. But as Cliff mentioned, those cigar products are pretty challenging to study and also compare, different product categories, cigarettes to cigars. So what we did, we adjusted the amounts of nicotine delivered and exhaled carbon monoxide delivered either per gram of tobacco smoke or per a liter of puff volume. And in that case, cigarettes deliver more nicotine per gram of tobacco than large cigars. A little bit of information about topography. As you can expect, large cigars are a larger product than cigarettes. So number of puffs, time to smoke, puff volume, puff velocities were significantly larger, and inter-puff interval was significantly shorter in large cigar smoking. So what this all means, basically we found out that people who regularly use both large cigars and cigarettes adapt their smoking patterns such as they are exposed to similar levels of nicotine from each product. This has been shown in other studies of tobacco products that in many cases people use tobacco products for nicotine delivery. So participants were pretty efficient in extracting nicotine to the levels they usually would. The immediate increase in plasma nicotine and carbon monoxide suggests significant inhalation of cigar smoke. So that's the thing I mentioned in the background section, that there is a subset of large cigar smokers who don't inhale or report not inhale cigar smoke, but this data suggests that they indeed were inhaling cigar smoke. This data call into question the assumption that cigar smoking is less toxic than cigarette smoking, which has been brought over and over, in some users or by the industry. By smoking large cigars, dual users expose themselves to toxic components that have been linked to with the addiction risk, morbidity, and mortality of cigarette smoking. The second study, so in the second study, we did something slightly different. So we recruited participants, and instead of letting them smoke cigar products as they would, we asked them to smoke them but not inhale the cigar smoke. And that's an important methodological consideration of the study, was to limit cigar smoke exposure to buccal tissue, largely the mouth and upper pharynx. And to do so, participants complied with specific instructions given before and during the directed smoking session to not inhale smoke. We control for smoke inhalation if exhaled carbon monoxide levels increased by more than 5 parts per million. The participants' data was not used or participants were excluded. So again, participants came to the laboratory. This study had another outcome measure we're interested in. We were measuring how this buccal absorption or nicotine exposure may be associated with tobacco pH in cigar products, and if there was a change in salivary pH. And the reason for that is that nicotine, the weak base, the higher the pH of the smoke, the more nicotine is bioavailable, and this may increase nicotine delivery or nicotine exposure. So here is a summary of or overview of the products we've used. This study investigated both small cigar products and large cigar products, focusing here on large cigars. In order to control for nicotine exposure or how much nicotine people would be getting from those products, we did product characterization, and we measure how much nicotine per gram of tobacco was in those products. And then you can see those markings on different products. And basically we weighted the products, and knowing how much nicotine would be per gram of tobacco, we adjusted the amount of smoke. So the silver lines are target goals for each product in order to smoke the tobacco with the same amount of nicotine. And also we measured pH of those products. So you can see that some of them were lower, some of them they were higher, and the goal was to select products that differ at least by 0.5 on the logarithmic scale. As far as the findings for the study, all the participants in the large cigar group were male, of age around 46 years, and 50% of participants identified as white. They had pretty significant history of smoking large cigars. They smoked them for approximately 8 years. And in the last 30 days, they reported smoking approximately 17 cigars, 17 cigars. So it means that they smoke on average around a cigar product every other day. As far as the finding, we did full pharmacokinetic curve in those participants. So we measured plasma nicotine before smoking, and then for a few hours after smoking. Only few participants had measurable post-smoking nicotine concentrations. And most of the nicotine concentrations were either below the quantification limit or below limit of detection. And even when plasma nicotine could be quantified, the measured increases were very small. So in the whole sample of our participants, they didn't extract or were not exposed to much of the nicotine when they were not inhaling. After correcting for creatinine, all measure urinary biomarkers tended to be higher in large compared to small cigars. However, due to small sample sizes, we didn't do any formal statistical comparisons for urinary biomarkers. So overall conclusions, I want to point out that in the first study we investigated dual users of large cigars and cigarettes. In the second study, we also had issues with finding exclusive cigar users. So something to remember is that those are not clean samples of exclusive large cigar users. Dual users of large cigars and cigarettes in our study inhaled significant quantities of carbon monoxide, nicotine, and presumably other components of mainstream smoke when they smoke large cigars, when they inhale large cigar smoke. From our investigation, it looks like buccal absorption plays little to no role in nicotine exposure from large cigar smoking, which means that increases in plasma nicotine levels result from smoke inhalation. Large cigar smoke exposure may lead to or sustain nicotine addiction. And also just for future directions or our observations from those studies with cigar users overall, but large cigars specifically, that it's a very challenging population. Premium cigar smokers, we had a lot of issues, getting traction and interest in large cigar users to participate in the studies, in our studies, compared to other tobacco products. We investigate regularly smokeless tobacco and products, cigarettes, etc. Most large cigar users in our studies were also poly users of tobacco products. So as I mentioned, we were not able to find large samples of exclusive users of cigars. They usually used something in addition. And non-inhalers of cigar smoke were almost non-existent. So when we ask people about inhaling cigar smoke, they almost all reported that they indeed inhale smoke when they smoke. And also what Cliff mentioned, due to the wide variety of large cigar sizes and shapes and design features, including tobacco pH, selecting representative study products for clinical research is also very, very challenging. So those are my conclusions. Here is additional information and literature. As I said, this short presentation, I was not able to provide a lot of details, but those can be found in the papers listed here. And if you have any questions, here is my email address, and so I invite anyone to send me questions. I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Great. Well, great. Thank you, Dr. Kozlowski, and thanks to all of our speakers. We have a few minutes now for questions, so let me open it up to the committee. And if you all could virtually raise your hands if you have any questions, we'll spend a few minutes. Neil, do you want to start? And then Pebbles.
Yes. First, thank you. Those were all really extremely informative presentations. I've got a question focused on the pH. So first, I'd like to ask Cliff what the variability is in premium cigar pH. We saw data from Bartow's study with 2 cigars of 6.3 and 6.7, which seemed a little bit low to me for premium cigars. But I'd like to know what range have you observed and what do we expect across products?
Yeah, Neil, I wish I had a better answer for you. We've never really measured. We measured smoke pH on cigarettes and some little cigars, never on the large cigars. But from the literature I've read, from like some of the old Hoffman work, is much higher. The pK up around 8, around 8-ish or so in that range.
Yeah, so for us, that's really a critical question if we're trying to understand premium cigars. What the range is, because if it's 6, you can easily inhale it. If it's 8, it's really hard to inhale.
Yeah, I had a bullet on my slide. I didn't have time to do it because I realized I was running out of time. But it reinforced what Bartok talked about in terms of, the conventional wisdom always was cigar smoke wasn't really inhaled because the pH and alkalinity was so high and you got enough oral absorption because, the bulk of the nicotine was in the freebase form. And so, the oral mucosa would absorb it rapidly enough and enough of it, you didn't need to inhale it. But there are some studies now that look like, there is some partial inhalation. And whether that's something that's always been there, or maybe the products have changed over the last, couple of decades where they're not quite as alkaline, I'm not really sure. And of course, there's always a possibility people, swallow the saliva that's saturated with, the mainstream smoke constituents. But there were some, I can't remember the study, but some lung dosimetry type studies. It does look like, some small fraction of users or some small amount of cigar smoke is inhaled. But I think that's limited by the pH, as you pointed out.
And then just a follow-up a pH question, the Bartos, how did you measure pH? Was that in the smoke or was that in the cigar itself? Can you clarify that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And just to add to what Cliff just said, we've actually published some data from the study. We measured pH and other characteristics of 10 large cigars and 10 small cigars for the study. So this data is available. However, we measured tobacco pH, so in water solution, which may differ from pH in smoke, and Cliff can speak more for that, but it's very challenging to measure pH in aerosol environment. So the differences probably exist.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, just
Pebbles.
to follow.
Oh, go ahead,
sorry.
Cliff. And
So I don't have any experience with large cigars, but in cigarettes, generally, the pH of the filler is, 1 or 1.5 pH units below what it is in mainstream smoke. I would assume it's the same for cigars.
Pebbles?
Thanks again for those very helpful presentations. I have two questions. One, for you said the average years smoked was about 8 to 9 years for the participants, and the mean age was about 40 something. So this is an older group of people for whom you would start seeing signs of disease indicators. And I was wondering if you actually looked at the comorbidities in those groups of people. Did you do oral exams with that group as well? So that's the first question. The second question is that because it's an older group and you had a rank in that group, and with the median age, this is about the age people start quitting cigarettes. So what I would like to know is, with those groups, are they former cigarette users and continued large cigar users? Do you have any data related to that?
I have data. I didn't present the data here, but those participants were dual users of cigarettes and cigars. So they had even longer history of smoking cigarettes. Some of them started quite early on at the age of 18 or 20. They all went through, from the study number 2, not number 1, but for the second study, they went through physical exam, and we recruit generally healthy participants. So if they self-report any serious diseases, they would be excluded based on physician recommendation.
So just to summarize what you said, with your sample, many of them were longer cigarette smokers, up to large cigar smoking a little bit later, and continue to be dual users.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
anyone else before we move to the next panel?
This has been Blunt. I just wanted to add to the response to Dr. Fagan's question to say for the INES data, that publication was very careful to differentiate between primary cigar smokers and secondary cigar smokers. In other words, they were exclusive cigar smokers when the biological specimens were collected, but it was how they got there, primary being no history of cigarette smoking, secondary meaning a history of cigarette smoking. And of course, with that second group, the secondary folks who perhaps had given up cigarette smoking and transitioned to cigar smoking, they were more intense in how they smoked their cigars.
Neil, did you have another question?
Yeah, if there's time, just one more.
I think we have a couple minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, so for Cliff, one thing I'm interested in is differences across premium cigars and constituents. Have you studied a number of different cigars, and are they significantly different from one another? Can we assume that they're all similar, or are the smoking yields and the machine yields different?
Neil, we don't have any direct data on that. We had a project that was set up. We were going to examine that very thing. That project got canceled a few years back. But my read of the literature is that generally, you burn organic matter and you get tobacco, leaf, and you get roughly similar type deliveries. Now, there's variations, depending on the type of tobacco, and also for the, how you generate the mainstream smoke. But looking at the mainstream smoke deliveries, my experience has been generally you get the same analyte levels, although there might be some variations. Things like metals could vary also too, because that depends on generally the soil where the tobacco is grown. But for the combustion products, they're very similar in terms of their fingerprints.
Okay, and then one more thing about the smoking machine, the parameter of 1.5 second puffs every 40 seconds and those volumes, where does that come from? Are those based on realistic observations of users of premium cigars, or where those parameters come?
So my understanding that was a Cresta recommended, so a consensus, sorry, it's late Friday. Basically, consensus panel pulled these together, and supposedly it was based on some older topography type data where people observed cigar smokers, with stopwatches and record, did the best to sort of record the puff, frequency and interval.
Thanks.
Pebbles, is your hand up again or still up?
No, it should be down. I'm sorry.
No problem. No problem. Well, thanks to all three of our speakers. We appreciate all of that information. That was very helpful. So we'll proceed to our second panel, which is going to focus on the health effects of premium cigars. And the speakers are Dr. Benjamin Chaffee, who is Associate Professor at UCSF, School of Dentistry. And I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce your name, Dr. Mia Hashibi. You can correct me out right now.
That was great.
Well, I grew up in Salt Lake and nobody could pronounce my last name. So Dr. Hashibi is a professor of in the Department of Family and Preventive Medicine at the University of Utah, and coordinates the International Health and Neck Cancer Epidemiology Consortium. So we'll begin with Dr. Chaffee, and then we'll move to our Q&A as we did the last time. So Dr. Chaffee, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Let me bring up some slides. So thanks for the invitation to present today. My name is Ben Chaffee. I'm from UCSF, the School of Dentistry. Today I'll be speaking, as you can see from the slides, a bit of an overview on the association between tobacco use and oral health with a focus on cigars. I receive funding from the NIH and from the California Department of Public Health. I'm also a paid consultant to Westat in relation to the PATH study in the design of some of their oral health measures. And I also want to committee for considering oral health as one of the possible implications of cigar use. Oral health, in my view, is extremely important. If we look worldwide, oral diseases, tooth loss, severe periodontal disease, dental caries affect somewhere between 3 to 4 billion people, more than half the global population. Just untreated tooth decay alone, so not filling, but actually having a cavity untreated without a filling, that affects more people worldwide than heart disease, cancer, diabetes, asthma, upper infections put together. And it's not just a question of these diseases clustering in low-income countries. They're also highly prevalent in wealthy countries. In the United States, for example, the experience of having tooth decay at some point during your life is near ubiquitous by adulthood, and upwards of half of US adults currently have some form of periodontitis, although perhaps not the most severe presentation. And while most oral conditions, oral cancer accepted, don't contribute much to fatalities, there are very important impacts on well-being and daily functioning, the ability to smile, to eat, to speak and express yourself. And these conditions are expensive to treat. Somewhere upwards of $100 billion are spent in the United States on dental treatment. And because largely of the high cost to the individual patient, we see very stark disparities in oral health, whether those disparities are defined by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic position, rural, urban geography. Indeed, because of these high costs, oral health is the one unmet healthcare need that most Americans say that they will forego or postpone because they can't afford it. And so, under this umbrella of oral health are a host of different conditions that have different pathophysiologies and presentations, but happen to share the same anatomical space. As you can see from this list on the slide, quite a few of those are either conclusively or at least potentially made worse by tobacco use. You can see cancer, periodontal disease, tooth loss up there on the top of the list as both prevalent and important, impactful diseases. The question marks next to some of these conditions like dental caries, there's perhaps the evidence is a little bit less tenuous, showing an association causally by use of tobacco. So for this presentation, focus primarily on periodontal disease. I expect you'll hear more in the next presentation from Dr. Ishibe on oral cancer. And I'll also primarily focus on the epidemiologic evidence. I'm an epidemiologist myself, and that's where I feel most comfortable discussing the strengths and weaknesses of various studies. And before I get too far in this presentation, I want to make sure I'm clear that, to my knowledge, there really are not any good studies to examine the differences, or any studies really, in potential oral health effects between different types of cigars used, premium cigars versus other types. But I'll speak to what evidence we do have when it comes to cigars in general. So I've talked about periodontal disease. What is that? So periodontal disease is an inflammatory condition. It's an inflammation in response to bacterial infection. So bacteria that live in the plaque and the tartar that is around and below the gum line. And what we see in this image here is highlighted in yellow is a tooth, if you're not used to looking at these types of radiographs, and the lower red line is the bone level around the tooth. So the periodontium is all the supporting structures that hold the tooth in place. It's the bone, the ligaments, the gums, and the upper red line is where we'd like to see that bone height in a healthy individual. So through the course of periodontitis, this individual has lost several millimeters of that supporting structure. And that happens through this overexuberant response to this infection that own inflammation actually damages and destroys these structures. Now, periodontitis can be quite mild. If we're just talking about gum inflammation, we call that gingivitis. But more severe periodontitis can actually lead to enough attachment loss that we lose teeth. It's a chronic inflammatory condition, which is associated with other inflammatory conditions. For example, in uncontrolled diabetes, bringing periodontal disease under control could be quite challenging. And we have decades of evidence. In fact, you see that first citation, even centuries of evidence showing that tobacco smoking is associated with worse periodontal disease or worse periodontal condition. And that's true regardless of how we define periodontal disease, whether it's as gingivitis or attachment loss or other clinical classifications. And these associations show up in different settings, whether you're looking at nationally representative studies, whether you do statistical adjustment for confounding, cross-sectionally, prospectively. We have very consistent evidence suggesting that tobacco smoking worsens periodontal disease. And this may happen through one mechanism. I've highlighted a few on the slide. The one on the top is probably a more active and open area of investigation, but that the exposure to smoke may actually change the composition of the oral microflora that live in the plaque biofilm, the plaque and the tartar that build up around the teeth. Now, this can't be the only mechanism, because some of the same pathogens that are responsible for periodontal disease can also be non-smokers, but it does appear in more modern RNA analysis techniques that at least the overall profile of microbes of smokers and non-smokers appears to differ. I've talked a bit about the inflammatory response of disease. And what smoking may do is, one, impair the ability of the host immune response to appropriately take action against infection. So say impairing chemotaxis of neutrophils, but also overstimulate different cytokine pathways that lead to too much inflammation that actually damages tissues. And also repair regeneration of these tissues after damage seems to be blunted in tobacco users, both in decreased activity of reparative cells like fibroblasts, osteoblasts that lay down new tissue, and also in restrictions of blood flow to gingiva that also make this kind of regeneration more difficult to achieve. And so most studies, like those I saw on the slides previously that look at periodontal disease and smoking, are really looking at cigarette smoking. But there are multiple studies, and I have a few examples here, that have shown association between worse periodontal disease state and use of non-cigarette products or other combustible products. So hookah water pipe is one. These studies mainly come out of Saudi Arabia. Cannabis, not a tobacco product, but a combusted product, has also been associated with periodontal disease cross-sectionally and longitudinally. And smokeless tobacco use, chew, spit tobacco, also associated with periodontitis. But today I'll focus on cigars. And the first study I'd like to highlight is the Baltimore longitudinal study of aging. So in this study, there was a sub-study that included oral health. And in this study of about 700 participants, it's unclear from the paper exactly when data were collected, but by publication date, I would assume sometime in the 1990s, though perhaps earlier. And clinical periodontal status was assessed by examination. Participants reported their use of cigarettes, cigars, or pipes. And in this study, there were very few cigar users. They defined cigar use as daily, and there were only 3 out of 700 people. So for analysis in this study, they combined those daily cigar users with former cigar users, and also with former and current users of pipes. And in that combined group, there was a higher prevalence of at least moderate periodontal disease compared to non-smokers, about 3 times higher. But that prevalence was a bit lower than what was seen among current cigarette smokers. Not surprising, because that group included former users. The next study to speak about is the Veteran Affairs Dental Longitudinal Study. So this is a cohort study. It began in the 1960s in the Boston area. It enrolled veterans, so not necessarily Veterans Administration patients, 100% male and nearly all white racially, also included about 700 participants. In some cases, follow-up extended to about 20 years. Tobacco status was self-reported and based on patterns of use during that full follow-up period. And in this study, there were about 50 participants classified as cigar smokers. They had 2 different outcomes. One of them was looking at teeth with that loss of alveolar bone height, like I'd shown on that earlier picture, at least 40% of that bone height being lost. That condition was diagnosed in 8% of non-smokers, but among smokers of cigars, cigarettes, and pipes, the prevalence was nearly twice as high. And in this model statistically adjusted for confounding factors, looking at the outcome tooth loss, that was elevated, tooth loss was, in cigarettes, cigars, and pipes, regardless of what you were smoking, compared to non-smokers. And in this study, they did not report a statistically significant difference between users of those different products, although I'll point out that the number of cigar smokers and pipe smokers was relatively small. This publication that came out in the early 1980s looked at the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey 1, which is a nationally representative cross-sectional study that collected data in the 1970s. And in this analysis, the authors looked at nearly 3,000 adults. And again, the number of users of cigars was about 50. So not a particularly large sample for these types of studies. Their outcome was the periodontal index. And what you need to know about this index is that higher scores mean worse disease state. Now, these are mean scores. And sure enough, cigarette smokers are worse off in this analysis than non-smokers or former smokers. But when the authors compared cigarette smokers to cigar smokers and pipe smokers, they did not find a statistically significant difference by product. Although despite lack of statistical significance, if you look numerically, cigar smokers do seem to be the worst off. And so the last study that I'll highlight is actually one in which I collaborated with Manali Vora, looking at data from PATH, the Population Assessment of Tobacco and Health. PATH, as we know, is a nationally representative prospective study that's currently active and collecting more data. But this analysis, Manali and I looked at just cross-sectional data from the first wave, collected in 2013 among adults, about 1,000 in our sample. And we looked at different patterns of tobacco use, and we combined cigar users together into one category. So traditional cigars, cigarillos, or filtered cigars, as defined in the PATH questionnaire. And that accounted for about 1% of our study population. It's roughly 600 individuals. And these are users of only cigars. If they were also using cigarettes or other tobacco products, they were in a different category. So the outcome was self-reporting, whether you'd ever experienced gum disease, whether you'd ever been treated for gum disease, and whether you'd ever been told by a professional that you have precancerous oral lesions. And so compared to a reference of tobacco never users, both exclusive cigarette smokers and exclusive cigar users were at heightened odds of these outcomes. But again, it's important to point out that these are cross-sectional data, so we're looking at ever experiencing gum disease or gum disease treatment compared to current cigar use, so that potential temporal mismatch needs to be considered a limitation. And for precancerous oral lesions, there's very wide 95% confidence intervals there. Those aren't statistically significant associations because there's a very uncommon outcome in this population. A couple comments about PATH. There's, in my opinion, there's more potential to look at cigar use in this study, including prospectively. I don't know yet of any prospective studies looking at differences by type of cigar that have yet been published from PATH. But in a real quick analysis, just looking at wave 4 and some unweighted cell counts, and we may hear more from Dr. Friedman in his presentation later today, there do seem to be a decent number of individuals using only traditional or only cigarillo type cigars and so forth. So perhaps there might be a possibility of looking at this in more detail when it comes to oral health outcomes and other outcomes. Although if you were to limit this only to exclusive cigar users, not users of cigarettes and other products, the numbers in this table would be much smaller. So that was a brief presentation, but what I'll say in summary is that yes, combustible tobacco use is strongly associated with worse periodontal state. It's been shown in numerous studies. And it's likely that this association also extends to use of cigars. We don't have a great number of studies, but the studies that we do have consistently show that cigar users have worse periodontal condition. With the caveat that this is based on a relatively small number of cigar users. And to my knowledge, we don't yet have any data to look at potential differences by cigar type, premium cigar versus others. But I'd be happy to discuss more during the question and answer period.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Chaffee. That's very helpful, and I'm sure we'll be following up. So let's turn now to Dr. Ashibe, and please, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Could I turn on my video? I think it's been disabled. Oh, great. Thanks.
There we go. And I am about to share your slides as well.
Great. Thank you. So I'll be talking about cigar smoking and the risk of head and neck cancer. This was a pooled analysis in the International Head and Neck Cancer Epidemiology Consortium, or INHANS. This is a group of cancer epidemiologists and head and neck cancer surgeons who mainly ran case control studies, and we pooled the data. Next slide, please. So this is a bit hard to see, but these are the funding sources of those individual studies that contributed to the pooled data. And so for the US studies, it's largely funded by NIH. And for studies outside of the US, it's mostly funded by national cancer agencies. And I listed my current recent employers and so on. Next slide, please. So just to give some background on head and neck cancer, we group cancers of the oral cavity, the oropharynx, hypopharynx, and larynx together. They share the etiology of tobacco and alcohol. And since the case numbers can be small in some of the centers, we tend to group them together. You can see that there are about 745,000 cases that are occurring each year in the world. On a world level, the oral cavity cancer site is the most predominant. In the US, that's been changing because of the increase in oropharyngeal cancers. And so right now there are more oropharyngeal cancer cases diagnosed each year. But on the worldwide level, oral cavity cancers are much more common. Next slide, please. So our study on the cigar smoking was published in 2013. But prior to that, there were epi studies that really supported the association between cigar smoking and head and neck cancer risk. But some of the studies were limited by fairly small sample sizes, which led to imprecise estimates. And there was difficulty trying to find exclusive cigar smokers. So in INHANCE, we wanted to analyze the association between cigar smoking and head and neck cancer risk. And we thought it was important to stratify on cigarette smoking, meaning we wanted to look at non-cigarette smokers and cigarette smokers, and then the risk of cigar smoking among those two groups, and also to try to find people who were exclusive or predominantly cigar smokers. Next slide, please. So these are the studies that were included in the pooled analysis. There were 19 studies in total. They're largely from Europe, US, and South America. And they together we had almost 14,000 head and neck cancer cases and about 18,000 controls. You can see some of these studies are multi-center, and in particular the IARC study was across multiple continents. And some of the centers didn't have cigar smoking in any of their subjects. So we dropped the center if none of their participants were cigar smokers. So we dropped about 800 cases and 1,000 controls due to that reason. Next slide, please. So in terms of the statistical methods, we used hierarchical logistic regression to estimate odds ratios and 95% confidence intervals. We expect heterogeneity across studies across continents, so we included study center as a random effect, and we adjusted for age, sex, race, ethnicity, and education. And for alcohol use, we adjusted for frequency in terms of milliliters of ethanol per day. And for cigarette smoking, we adjusted in years, and pipe smoking, we also adjusted in years. Next slide, please. So for cigar smoking, we had these 4 variables. So never ever cigar smoking, frequency was in times per day, duration was in years, and cumulative use was estimated by taking the product of the frequency, the duration, and we assumed about 4 grams of tobacco per cigar. And this was from some equivalents that we found in an IARC handbook. And so the analyses of these 4 variables were stratified by cigarette smoking. Next slide, please. So we defined exclusive cigar smoking as people who only smoke cigars and didn't smoke cigarettes or pipes. And then we also looked at dominant and predominant use. So we calculated the total lifetime tobacco grams from the 3 main tobacco smoking products, so cigarettes, cigars, and pipes. And then we multiply frequency and duration, and you can see the tobacco equivalents that we assumed in each of those products. So dominant cigar use was defined as 100% lifetime use of only cigars, and predominant cigar use was defined as 66.6 to 99.9% of lifetime use. Next slide, please. So this is the overall characteristics of the head and neck cancer cases and controls. So the cases were diagnosed from 1981 to 2007. You can see that in terms of race ethnicity, it's predominantly non-Hispanic white, with about 65% of cases and 76% of controls who are non-Hispanic white. The next biggest group is Latin American. So there were from studies based in Latin America, and so that constituted about 28% of cases and 17% of controls. The Hispanic Latino group you can see are from the US studies. And head and neck cancer is predominantly among males, so you can see that there are about 80% of the cases are men and about 20% are women. The controls are generally matched on frequency, matched on age and sex. Next slide, please. So these are our results. So for cigar smoking and head and neck cancer risk, this is specifically among never cigarette smokers. So we see a 2.54 increase in risk of head and neck cancer for ever cigar smoking. And we see a clear dose response trend for frequency of smoking. You can see that the p-value for trend is statistically significant. And so people who smoke more than 10 cigars per day have a 10-fold increase in risk of head and neck cancer, but this is specific to the never cigarette smokers. Next slide, please. And in terms of duration and cumulative use, we also saw very clear dose response trends. So you can see that for people who've smoked more than 40 years of cigars, the odds ratio is 5.62 for head and neck cancer risk. And then for cumulative use of more than 20 cigar a year, the increase in risk is about 4.87-fold. Sorry, I forgot to mention that these are all adjusted for, the basic demographic factors and also for frequency of alcohol use and also the duration of pipe smoking. Next slide, please. These are the results for the ever cigarette smokers. So if you look at cigar smoking among ever cigarette smokers, there's no clear association. The odds ratio was 0.9, and it's not statistically significant. Similarly, for frequency, we don't see a clear trend. So this is a little bit counterintuitive, but the never cigar smokers, where you see about 10,000 cases and 9,000 controls, those includes people who smoke cigarettes. And so the odds ratio of 0.9 is estimating an added risk of cigar use, but cigar use is fairly infrequent relative to cigarette use. So perhaps any added risk was kind of not more harder to detect statistically. Next slide, please. And similarly for duration and cumulative use, we didn't see any clear dose response trends for cigar smoking. But again, this is specific to people who ever smoked cigarettes. Next slide, please. So this is looking at the exclusive and joint use and head and neck cancer risk. So the most interesting result is a little bit towards the bottom. We see a 3.49 increase in risk for people who only smoke cigars. And in this large series, we only see about 110 cases and 103 controls who only smoke cigars. And from the third line from the top shows the people who smoke cigarettes and cigars. And so that group has about a 3-fold increase in risk. So the magnitude of risk is fairly similar for cigar use and cigarette use. Next slide, please. And then we also tried to look at the dominant and predominant use. So for people who only smoke cigars, the increase in risk is about 3.56. And then we also have the predominantly cigar, and that is a 3.2-fold increase in risk for head and neck cancer. Next slide, please. So in summary, cigar smoking is clearly associated with head and neck cancer risk. This was among never cigarette smokers, and we had clear dose response trends for frequency, duration, and cumulative use. And we also see increased head and neck cancer risk for exclusive cigar users and among dominant and predominant cigar users. And the magnitude of risk for cigar smokers seem fairly similar to that of cigarette smoking. Next slide, please. So I'd like to thank the analysis and writing group, Dr. Anna Weiss, who's currently at NIEHS, and Dr. Andy Olshan from UNC, all the Enhanced Consortium members, and the various grants that supported this work. Thank you.
Great. Thanks to you and Dr. Chaffee for those remarks. I appreciate them. Let me take the prerogative of chair and ask first question. Did you actually calculate the cigar attributable head and neck cancer risk?
Oh,
What proportion?
We did not. That would be great to calculate. Yeah, we could do that.
Yeah, you have the data.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Yeah, we'd be very interested to know sort of how big of the problem can be accounted for by cigars. So let me open it up to the our panel, and first on the docket is Maciej.
Thank you so much for the very informative presentations. I actually have a questions to both speakers. We have start with Ben. Ben, would you expect that if, we heard from the previous presentations that there might be kind of two types of the cigar users, that what those refer as inhalers versus non-inhalers. Would you expect that if someone is non-inhaling the smoke and is keeping the smoke for a long time in the mouth, so the contact between the tissue, the oral tissue is longer with the smoke, would you expect the risk to be somehow elevated in those persons?
I think that's possible. I don't know of data yet to test that hypothesis. So when I presented earlier, there were different mechanisms by which exposure to smoke or exposure to tobacco products might enhance periodontal disease. So if you're thinking about something like, say, changing the bacterial ecosystem within the mouth, then more contact to smoke in the mouth could be important in that pathway. But if you're speaking about something like, let's say, vasoconstriction or immune activity that's through circulating chemicals, well, maybe that gets into the bloodstream through inhaled smoke that then enters into the lungs. I'm not a physiologist, so I can't go into the details there, but yeah, the short answer is I think that's possible, but not necessarily true.
Okay, thanks. And to Dr. Heshuba, I have two questions. The one, are there any other cancer locations that you study, or are there any available data, let's say on cancer that we thought might be more associated with inhaling the smoke, let's say lung cancer? Do you have the data on the lung cancer risk in a cigar smokers? And the second question is about the patterns of use. You stratified your population based on number of cigars, per day, and the group of was more than 10 cigars per day. That sounds very intensive. Is it what you see that pattern really common in your study?
I don't think it's that common. Yeah, that sounds really surprising to me. I think, I mean, I don't smoke cigars myself, but yeah, I mean, we see crazy numbers in terms of number of cigarettes as well. So I think we just analyze it as it is. But lung cancer, actually, I'm not an expert for lung cancer and cigar specifically. I'm very expert in head and neck cancer, so I'm not totally sure about the data. But I was thinking about the cigar versus cigarillo question, and about 2 or 3 of the studies I listed just asked, oh, did you smoke cigars or cigarillos? And they don't differentiate, getting more specifics between those. And then 2 separate studies asked about the size of the cigar, but I don't think that's been analyzed very closely yet. So yeah, it's unfortunate there isn't a bit more data, but I think most of these studies tended to focus a lot more on the cigarette smoking, which was much more predominant, but yeah.
Thank you so much.
Neil.
As Maciej said, thanks very much to both of you for your presentations. I've got a question which you might not be able to answer, but I'm just curious. The pattern of premium cigar use is so much different than a cigarette. For example, a person can puff on a premium cigar for 2 hours, but may be using just 1 a day versus someone who's smoking 10 cigarettes per day. is there any reason to believe that that sort of continuous exposure for 2 hours would be different or more harmful or less harmful than smoking 10 cigarettes per day at say an hour interval piece?
That's a great question. I don't think we've explored that. I don't know if we can, because we ask frequency just in terms of times per day, and we don't ask, how long did you smoke the cigar for over that time that you were smoking that cigar. So I think our questionnaires are kind of limited in trying to assess that, unfortunately.
The other thing in terms of the constituents involved for cancer, I know nitrosamines are involved with other things in particular that we should be looking for in terms of smoke constituents that are carcinogenic that might be different in different cigars.
That might be a more appropriate question for Dr. Blunt or the previous session. Yeah.
Okay, and the final question is, assuming that the pH is different for big cigars versus other cigars, does pH play a role at all in periodontal disease or in cancer?
I'm not sure for cancer. Yeah.
For periodontal disease, not that I don't believe so. A lot of periodontal disease, the bacteria are actually living below the gum line, and usually as you further down you go from in the oral cavity down into the sulcus between the tooth and the gums, there's actually a real change in the environment there. You get more anaerobic species versus aerobic species. And so the saliva does a pretty good job of buffering the pH. And this is speculative on my part, but I would guess that pH changes from smoke would be less likely to affect that part of the oral environment versus the mouth overall. pH is very important for dental caries. We were talking about dissolving the acid of the teeth. But in terms of epidemiology connecting any tobacco smoking to dental caries, that's not as strong a relationship. So I'm not sure that that's as important a consideration as some of the other components of these products.
Thanks.
So a follow-up to Dr. to Mache's question, and I guess it's for you, Dr. Hashibe, is do we know anything about the ratio of head and neck cancers to lung cancers for these different tobacco types?
You mean just the incidence of the lung cancer?
Right. Well, adjusting them for some of the factors, presumably, but basically, can we say that the head and neck cancers are a much larger proportion for cigar smokers than for cigarette smokers? Do we know what those ratios look like?
That's a good question. I don't think we have data of, maybe it's possible in some of the cohorts or cohort consortia where you look at just the cigar smokers and then see what percent are getting head, neck versus lung. But yeah, I've never seen analysis like that. But I mean, lung cancer is much more common, obviously, than head and neck cancers in the US. And I think for head and neck cancer, we say it kind of depends on the geographic region, but in the US, we say about 50% are attributable to tobacco and alcohol combined. And right now, HPV is becoming a big proportion for the oropharyngeal cancers and head neck. And then for lung cancer, I'm a bit less familiar, but I think it's a bit higher, like maybe 80% are attributed to tobacco overall. So I'm not sure if there are really specific numbers for cigar smoking, but.
Mache, and then Grace.
Yes, just a quick question to follow on. Dr. Hashibe, you mentioned some differences across the countries. I want to ask about it. So do you see in the countries where the cigar smoking might be actually more prevalent than here in the US, or there is more kind of clear pattern of use, I mean, exclusive use of the cigars instead of poly tobacco use that is common here? Do you see differences across the countries?
Yeah, I did have some extra slides by region. Maybe that could be pulled up while I'm talking about this, but the European, the cigar smoking, the estimate was about 5.5, which is very high, but there weren't, oh, this is among the never cigarette smokers. There were less cigar smokers. So in North America or US, the number of cigar smokers was a bit higher. But yeah, it's slide 21, I think. I was hoping people would ask some extra questions so I could show my extra slide. Oh, if you could go to the next one. Oh, next slide, please.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, here, yeah. So this is results by region. So you can see North America, the estimate for cigar smoking is about 1.5-fold increase in risk. In South America, the habit was pretty not very common. So we couldn't really even provide clear estimates there. So this does look statistically significantly different in terms of Europe versus North America. Yeah.
Okay.
Grace?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that great presentation. I have a question for Dr. Hashibe about whether there's any data on secondhand cigar smoke exposure and head and neck cancer. I was just kind of curious about this because I think there are some subpopulation who had a lot of exposure to cigar smoking, for example, like, you know, workers who work in cigar bars or something like that. So are there any evidence of this?
That would be really interesting to look at. Most of, or maybe half of these enhanced studies do have secondhand smoke information. And we have analyzed that, and it's a little bit harder to show clear associations for that. You know, it's much more clear for lung cancer for secondhand smoke, but I have not seen where we assess secondhand smoke. We don't ask, you know, was it due to cigarettes or cigars? So we don't usually go into that level of detail, unfortunately. So it's usually more like, oh, have you been exposed to passive smoking at home or at work? How many hours do you think it is per day or something like that? So yeah, we don't dive into that level of detail, unfortunately.
Excellent. Well, thanks to you both for very informative presentations. We appreciate it very much. So let's go ahead and I'll move on to our last session. And for this session, we'll be hearing from Dr. Neil Friedman, who's Senior Investigator at the National Cancer Institute. And he'll be talking to us today on on tobacco use data and surveys. So whenever you're ready, Dr. Friedman, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I was asked this for my disclosure. So since 2004, I've been a US government employee in the intramural research program of the National Cancer Institute, and they provide almost all of my funding, though I do have one project which has funds that are partly provided through an interagency agreement with FDA Center for Tobacco Products, but I'm not going to be talking about that today. And then if you can go to the next slide. The opinions are those of myself. They don't reflect the NCI or my collaborators from either the US FDA or the Census Bureau. And then the other thing we wanted to see if you can go to advance. So all of the results have been reviewed to ensure that there's no confidential information disclosed, and that's important because some of the work I'm going to talk about takes advantage of the national surveys. Okay, so if you can go to the next slide, I've been very interested in these data. So this is recent data from the National Youth Tobacco Survey for high school students, and then the National Health Interview Survey for adults, showing the different types of tobacco products used in the United States. And so cigars are there, about the estimate was 3.6% within adults and NHIS. And high school students, that's 5%, and in high school students, it's actually higher than cigarettes. And then the other group that I think is really interesting is the dual or poly users, and that's estimated to be about 4% of adults and 8% of high school students. And so some of the research that I've been doing is to try to increase our understanding of the health risks of non-cigarette tobacco products. And so if you go to the next slide, one of the things I was interested in cigars, and this is, I'm sure you're familiar with this really nice meta-analysis that was led by Chang and colleagues that was in BMC Public Health in 2015. But this is showing the different prospective studies of cigar smoking and mortality. And I was interested in this for a couple of reasons. The first is that if you look through these studies, such as the Dorn study or the Male British Doctors, Washington County, Maryland, the CPS-1 and CPS-2, these are landmark, very influential and famous, legendary cohort studies, if you will, but they're all kind of old. So like the Dorn study enrolled between 1954 and 57. So that's, 70 years old, 60 or 70 years old. Even CPS-2 enrolled in the early 1980s. So that's 40 years old. And so I wanted to be able to try to develop risk estimates for cigars with more recent cohorts. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. One other point I wanted to make is this is from that meta-analysis about current cigar smoking and lung cancer. And so you can see that there's relatively few studies. And then among the studies that some of them, they're primary, they call primary, which means that these people were comparing sort of only cigar users to never tobacco users. But then there's also secondary, which were people who were exclusive current cigars, but they had used other tobacco products such as cigarettes in their past. And so I think it's difficult to interpret when someone's a former cigarette smoker, for example, what part of the disease risk is coming from that cigarette use versus the cigars. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, please. So my motivation was that there's clear that cigars increase the risk for a number of different cancer types and diseases, and this has been mentioned by IARC monographs and other expert agencies and reviews. But most prior studies were conducted many years ago. Few of the cohorts have information about intensity, duration, or cessation of use. The studies generally have not had information about cigar type. And then there's little information about dual use. And as Dr. Blunt mentioned, there's even less with dual use with marijuana. And there's also little information about whether associations vary by race, ethnicity, sex, age, and SES. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to go through some of the studies that I've done. This study here was from the Agricultural Health Study, which is a large cohort of pesticide applicators and their spouses. So if you go to the next slide. This was about 85,000 participants and who lived in Iowa and North Carolina with enrollment between 93 and 97 with follow-up to 2011. And like this other cohorts I'm going to show, we did Cox proportional hazards regression with adjustments for age, gender, race, state, education, and alcohol. And this was with incident cancer. But unfortunately, the study only assessed ever and never use of cigars for 6 months or later. And so there's not any information about whether they're a current or former user or how much they use. So these are the results. If you go to the next slide, please. So comparing cigarette smokers to cigar smokers, these are exclusive users of cigarettes or exclusive cigar. So first, you can tell that the number of cigarette smokers and the number of deaths that we had among them, and the number, sorry, I misspoke. The number of cigarette smokers and the number of incident cancer cases among them is much higher for cigarettes than for cigars. And so that means that the confidence intervals and the precision of the estimates is quite a bit better for for cigarettes. But for cigars, you see there, these are the numbers that we had, and there's an association for total incident cancer, smoking-related cancers. These were defined based on cigarettes, and then also urinary cancers, which would be sort of mostly bladder. And you can see there we didn't have a risk estimate for lung, and that's because there were only 3 cases of lung cancer among the exclusive cigar smokers. So this was a little disappointing, I have to say. So then the next study we did was within the context of the NCI Cohort Consortium. And the goals of this consortium are sort of getting cohorts to work together. The idea that if you bring multiple cohorts together, you can sort of tackle questions that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So we thought that like cigar and pipe smoking would be a good thing to tackle here because most individual cohorts don't have enough users to really be able to make very firm conclusions. So this is the results here on the next slide. So we had 5 cohorts that agreed to be part of the study: the Netherlands cohort study, the Melbourne collaborative cohort study, the vitamins and lifestyle cohort, the NIH-AARP cohort, and the PLCO cohort. So that these cohorts enrolled between 86 and 2002. All told, there was maybe 525,000 participants. Again, we did Cox proportional hazards regression, adjusting for age, gender, BMI, race, ethnicity, SES, alcohol, and family history. But unfortunately, 3 of the 5 studies only asked about ever never use. So if you go to the next slide, these are the results shown here for ever cigarette smoking versus never smoking. And then these are different incident cancers. So there was an association with smoking related cancers, again defined based on cigarettes. And also an association with lung cancer. You can see there was 87 cases among the exclusive cigar smokers. And then there was some evidence for head and neck cancer, but really not for the other cancers. But you'll notice that the number of cancers that we have is really relatively small for particularly many of the cancer types. So this is sort of what we could find in terms of prospective cohorts. And so the last 2 studies I wanted to show you really took advantage of the national surveys we were trying to think a little bit outside the box of what had been done before. So the first study I wanted to talk about was from the National Health Interview Survey. So as you probably all know, this is an annual household survey that's nationally representative, and they've been collecting tobacco data and supplements since 1965. And these data are linked to mortality from the National Death Index. And so there's several advantages of this. One of them is that because they're national, they're designed to survey the entire US population, the tobacco use patterns are reflective of the US population. So, like when our study that we did among agricultural pesticide applicators, you could say, okay, that's a special group of people. They're different systematically in ways from the other parts of the US population. Whereas in the national surveys, they're really trying as best they can to sort of estimate things within the national population. So there's some advantages for that. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, please. So detailed smoking data is collected in the NIH-IS. There's things that are consistent across every year. There's things that differ, but this is sort of a grid showing the different kinds of exposures that they have based on study year or survey year. And so included on here is information about cigars. So what we did is we took the surveys that asked about cigars, if you can go to the next slide, and we pooled the data together. So this was the 91, 92, 98, 2000, 2005, and 2010 surveys with follow-up and the follow-up at the time was through December 31st, 2015. So all told, we had 165,000 participants, and we did Cox proportional hazard regression, accounting for the complex weighting and design of these studies. And here, ever cigar use was defined as people who used more than 50 times in their life. And the models were adjusted for age, sex, education, race, ethnicity, and survey year. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, these are the results, again, for all-cause mortality, comparing cigarettes to cigars. So one thing that's, again, sort of immediately apparent, I think, is that the number of deaths that we have so the number of cigar users are much lower than the number of cigarette users, and the number of deaths are much lower. But the surveys allowed us to distinguish between current daily users and non-daily users of cigars and cigarettes, for that matter. And we saw an association with daily cigar use. We didn't observe an association among either former cigar users or non-daily cigar users. But one of the limitations of this data is that we don't really have information about, like a non-daily user means that maybe they used in the last 30 days, but we don't know whether they used 20 days of that, or they used 1 day. And we don't know how many cigars they used in the month either. So this is a kind of a mixed group. Okay, so then, and the other limitation is that if you've only got, say, 42 deaths among current daily cigar smokers, then it's really difficult to, almost impossible to say, okay, what about lung cancer, or what about heart disease, or what about stroke, or what about respiratory disease? And then it's also, we can't really break down into men and women or by race and ethnicity. Okay, next slide, please. So the next project that I wanted to talk about was within a different survey, and this is the tobacco use supplement to the current population survey. As opposed to every year, this one's administered every 3 to 4 years, and has really quite extensive information available about different types of tobacco products, mostly cigarettes, but they have good information about cigars as well. this survey is quite big, so it's every 3 to 4 years, but it's quite big. And then a subset of the participants who completed the tobacco use supplement have been linked to mortality. And so if you go to the next slide, please. So what we did here is that we pooled together data from the 1985, and then the 92, 93, 95, 96, 98, 99, 2000, 2001 and 2, and so forth up to 2011. So then all told, and this one was bigger, we had 357,000 participants with follow-up between December 31st, 2011. And so in this project, we compared cigarettes, cigars, and pipes. And we also were able to look at daily, non-daily, and then also former and current. And we had 51,000 total deaths. So these are the results here. If you go to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Again, we adjusted for sex, race, ethnicity, education, and survey year with never tobacco users as the reference. And again, we took into account the weighting of the surveys. Okay, next slide, please. So comparing cigarettes to cigars, again, you see that we have many more deaths occurring among cigarette smokers, which is reflecting that there's a lot more of them in the analysis. But nevertheless, we had 140 daily cigar users, and then there was a relevant evidence for increased risk of mortality among this group, with no association observed among non-daily smokers or former users. And then because we had a little bit more numbers here, we were able to look at individual causes of death to some extent, and that's shown on the next slide, which is this is tobacco-related cancer mortality. So on the left, that's exclusive cigarette smokers. So you can see that we had 57,000 daily cigarette smokers, and 3,000 of them had died during follow-up, and so there was a relative risk of about 4.3. But if we look at exclusive cigar smokers, we had 530 daily exclusive cigar smokers. The reason there's a star there is that means that we can't release the actual number of deaths that we have there because it's too small, and there's concerns about disclosure and identifiability of the people. But nevertheless, there was a few deaths there, and we saw an association with exclusive daily cigar smoking with tobacco-related cancer mortality. And again, the endpoint here was based on what's known about cigarettes. Okay, so if you go to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit, and sorry, I pushed the forward one more time, about dual use. So these are people who use 2 or more times. And so I've done one project within the NHIS about this topic. So if you go to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, this was the 91 to 1988, 2000, 2005, and 10 surveys. We had 118,000 participants. So we restricted it to people who used exclusives. So we weren't able to look at all of the different combinations of products. So what we did do is compare exclusive cigarette smokers to people who use cigarettes plus another product. And we're again doing Cox proportional hazards regression with adjustments for age, sex, race, ethnicity, education, and survey year. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the things that was interesting to me, first off, I think it's important to realize that like this, we are looking here at tobacco use at the time of these surveys, and that doesn't necessarily reflect what people are doing now. If you recall that the surveys really were a decade or more ago. But nevertheless, at that time, I found it was really interesting that if you take the exclusive cigarette smokers, they reported smoking about 450 cigarettes per month, whereas the people who said they used cigarettes plus cigar or pipe, which was based on our numbers, we had to group them together, they said they did 600 cigarettes per month. And then cigarettes plus smokeless tobacco, that was 510. And then the people who said they use cigarettes, either cigars or pipe and smokeless tobacco, reported 600 cigarettes per month. So in general, it looked like the people who were using dual users these tended to people who used more cigarettes. And then the other thing is these are the dual users, but you can see that at the bottom that they tend to be, although they're dual users, they're not using these other tobacco products every day. Okay, so next slide. So what we saw with the risk of all-cause mortality is that if we compare a never tobacco user with a hazard ratio of 1, that basically the associations for the dual users and the poly users were similar or a little bit stronger than the cigarette smokers only. And then we tried to a little bit based on the best we can to sort of distinguish between daily and non-daily use of the different products. So if you go to the next slide, please. That's shown here. So on the columns there are non-daily cigarettes and daily cigarettes, and then the rows are non-daily cigar pipe or daily cigar pipe. And so you see a relative risk of 1.29 for people who are non-daily cigarette smokers and non-daily cigar pipe users. And then the relative risk was 2.4 among the non-daily cigarette users who used pipe or cigar every day. And then the daily cigarettes who were non-daily cigar pipes had a relative risk of 2.5, and it was a little stronger among people who said they were daily cigarettes and daily cigar pipe smokers. But a limitation of this analysis is that we don't know the lifetime use. There's good information about the lifetime use of cigarettes, but not cigars. So we don't know how many years the person used cigars for. We don't really know the intensity of the cigar use. And so we don't know whether they've used cigarettes since they were 16 and cigars since they were 50 or cigars since they were 30. We don't have that information. So I think that's really a limitation of what we can say. Okay, next slide, please. So in conclusion, so far, cigar smoking, I think we can say, increases the risk of overall mortality in a number of diseases, including cancers. But existing cohorts, unfortunately, tend to lack substantial numbers of exclusive cigar users or dual users of cigarettes and cigars. They also tend to lack assessment about key metrics that we'd really like to know about. So for example, duration, cessation, frequency, cigar type. And they've limited, because there's relatively limited numbers of deaths, that limits the ability to examine specific diseases or causes of death, and then also limits the ability to stratify by sex, race, ethnicity. And then I have one more slide, and that is to talk about a new data set called the Tobacco Longitudinal Mortality Study, which is being created now. It's a collaboration between Census, FDA, CTP, and NCI and NIH. It's substantially larger, so it'll be 4 to 6 times bigger than the previous linkage with more surveyors, longer follow-up. And there's starting to be information about types of cigars, brands, flavors, and then also days of the month using cigars. The linkage is occurring now. And so we don't know the end number of cigars users and deaths among them, but we think it should be better than what we've got right now. Okay, so then the last slide is just to thank all of the people who've contributed to these analyses, and thanks to everyone for their attention.
Great. Well, thanks, Dr. Friedman. That's interesting and productive work. I'm glad to see there's a future where we may actually get better information. So
Yes.
With that, let me open it up to my colleagues on the committee. And those of you who have questions for Dr. Friedman? Neil, dependable Neil. You always have queries.
Yeah, I just get lots of questions. So
Good.
That's very informative. What seems to me, and obviously you couldn't tell what kind of cigars, but it seemed like the data are pretty consistent, saying that if you do not smoke cigars daily, there's no increased risk. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's what consistent we've seen. They haven't seen evidence for associations among people who don't smoke daily. The only thing that I would say about that is that we don't have a lot of good information about actually like what is a daily within the context of these studies, what is a non-daily cigar smoker. So I think that there would be a big difference. Like we see, I've been doing some projects about non-daily cigarette use, for example, and you see a big difference about someone who smokes 1 cigarette a month, 1 day a month, versus someone who smokes 20 days in the month and 3 cigarettes on the days they smoke. And so because we don't have that information for cigars, I'm not sure what it'll look like if we actually were able to say, okay, people that smoke 10 cigarettes, people who smoke 10 cigars per month, this is what the risk is. But yes, at least so far that we've done, we haven't seen evidence for an association among non-daily cigar use.
Yeah, so that just in general, that's important for us because many of the people we've spoken to say that premium cigar smokers don't smoke every day. They smoke an average of just a few cigarettes a month. And so if that's the case, it seems like your data at least would suggest that there is no increased cancer or mortality risk.
I feel a lot better if we actually had good data about how much people were using in that category, but what you say is entirely consistent with the data.
Thanks.
Raphael and then Wei.
Hi, Neil. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. This is really informative and helpful. One clarification question and then maybe a question about the future. So for the Malhotra study, you mentioned those were exclusive cigar users. I don't know if that was maybe you got confused with the term, but were those exclusive cigar users?
Yes.
Okay, so that's so those numbers we can in some ways.
Yeah, they're exclusive. They're exclusive cigars. They also, in that paper, they also have, so some of the studies have like, you know, cigar indoor pipe or, you know, so, but yeah, there is, I took the column that's like, was the exclusive cigar smokers.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful.
They tried to do an analysis there where like, you know, people who said they did cigars and pipes, they tried to proportion it out in times of life, you know, like of different times of their life and things, but there is that one, that more pure exclusive cigar. Yeah.
And maybe a question that not necessarily you might know the answer, but since you told us about what's coming with the larger data set that's being put together, do you have any sense of the timeline and if we're talking about something which is within the summer, sometime this year, sometime this decade? Yeah.
Well, so we've heard updates very recently that it seems very promising that it'll be ready very soon, but I should mention that we thought it was going to be ready 8 months ago too. So, you know, that there's been some issues with COVID and getting people together in terms of like in the same room and not getting training and then getting everything signed off in order to, it probably shouldn't be so difficult to have things between two different government agencies like NCHS and Census. But anyway, so it's been a slow process. So it's definitely going to happen, but I'm trying not to, you know, hold my breath for exactly when it is, because I think a lot of people have been excited about that data set for a long time, because it should open up things because it's so much bigger than what's been available before. But yeah, but it's not ready yet.
Thank you. And related to that, so in terms of, you mentioned that it might open the opportunity to do analysis by cigar type, and
yeah,
you know, but that will be only for the latest or years of TUS or yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The TUS has been asked for a long time, and then over the years they've been adding more questions that are relevant, I think, to the mission of this group. So there's more data for cigars, but that's only a subset of them, and it's a little hard to know exactly when there's these linkage projects. Like sometimes, you know, people can't be linked and so forth. So that's why I couldn't share like, this is the number of cigar users in that data set, and this is the number of people that we're going to have, you know, by type, and then there's some brand information. So like, you know, this is the number of people use that brand and so forth. But it's really hard to predict until we actually have the linkage finished. And so that's why I was not able to share any of that, is because we just don't know yet.
Thank you.
Thanks. Wei.
Actually, some of my questions are overlap with Rafael. I want to ask another question. It sounds very exciting that in your TLMS study, there will be more information about the types and brand, etc., of cigars. And you know, for this group, we really have difficult to tease out from literature whether some studies are based on premier cigar or overall cigar. So, so the two questions to you. The first one is it possible in any of the study you presented right away, just a few minutes ago, whether there is a possibility that we can tease out the premier cigar, or whether there is any information about premier cigar? And the second question is how will the TLMS data help inform premier cigar specifically?
So the first question, unfortunately, is just no. They asked about cigar use, and not even that comprehensively. So I wish I could say yes, but no. And then for the second question, So the cigar type doesn't ask specifically for premium cigars. It asks for the main types. So whether it's a big cigar, whether it's, you know, a small cigar, but the brands I think should help distinguish because, you know, which of the ones would be classified as premium. But I can't say for certain because I haven't actually tried to do that myself. And as far as I'm aware, there may be people have used the data to sort of talk about the market share of the different types of cigars, but I'm not sure whether those studies have actually been done either. So I think it's certainly, on the one hand, I think it certainly will provide more information that's been available as of yet, and the fact that you know, it's substantially bigger will offer much better statistical power for answering a lot of disease-based associations. But in terms of specifically being able to isolate certain premium cigars, I'm not sure.
I see. Thank you.
But I can certainly, I can pass along the questionnaires that have been used, and so then it has those questions and the list of brands that were asked about. Perhaps that would be helpful.
Oh, that would be very, very helpful for us.
Okay.
Thanks.
Sure.
Jay.
Thank you so much, Neil, for the great presentation. Just a quick question. I know you show a lot of data on the different different types of cancer, and I just want to make it if you can clarify. So you don't see any like certain pattern of the cancer types among the cigar smokers that would be different from cigarette smokers, for example. You mentioned a little bit about the lung cancer that you were not able to detect or estimate the risk because of the small number of cases. So would it be possible that actually, you know, the prevalence of the lung cancer among the cigar smokers is actually so low, and that might be associated with the inhalation pattern or frequency, as you mentioned before? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I saw your question before, and I've been thinking about that. So the agricultural health population is a little bit different. In general, for example, farmers have a lower risk of lung cancer than other occupations, and then some of it's been saying is because they're less likely to use cigarettes, that, you know, they're outside in the fields, and so, you know, maybe the smokeless tobacco is more common. But in general, I was reviewing a little bit. It's a little hard to say because each of the studies, I think like a big meta-analysis is maybe a better way to go, because each individual studies has relatively few numbers of cancer. But my general sense is that the pattern and distribution of the cancers that are occurring within cigar smokers don't seem very different to me than you would see among cigarette smokers. So for example, the data that I showed from the study that Carl Christensen led within the TLMS, the NLMS, the reason that I showed you the lung cancer is because that was the one that was the most number of cancers we had about cigar relief for individual site was lung. So that even though we didn't have very many deaths, so there was the most there. So in general, I don't think we have evidence that it's systematically different than what you would see in a cigarette smoker, though it's a little bit like, because the prevalence is lower and probably the intensity and the frequency of use is lower. Because of that, in general, I think the risks are a little lower because of that intensity frequency lower. So then you also tend to have, like, you know, the background is sort of the rates of all of the other cancers that would be in the population. So like the cancers that you're seeing among cigar smokers, a lot of it is things like, there'll be things that are like colon cancer or prostate cancer or things where it's not really tobacco related, if that makes sense.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Any final questions for Dr. Friedman? If not, thank you so much. That was highly informative, and we appreciate all your time. And thanks to all of our speakers. I think the sessions today have been very helpful. We will turn now to seek comments from anyone else who'd like to address the committee. Because we're on a Zoom webinar, as you know. Anyone who wants to make comments needs to type them into the Q&A box on Zoom, and staff will read them aloud. So please recognize that we're only going to be looking at comments relevant to today's discussion or the committee statement of tasks. So if you have any queries, please put them in the Q&A box. And let me turn to staff, since I'm not sure I see all of these. Let me know if you have any. I see no open questions, but let's give everybody a minute or two to.
Yes, as of now, there are no questions or comments.
Give them another minute or two. I hope they haven't taken an early break and gone off on their Memorial Day weekends.
I didn't blame them if they did.
Can you tell if people are typing things in? I can't.
I can only see if once a question is there, if it's there. So maybe.
All right, we'll give them another minute then.
Yeah. Sorry, I know it's awkward on the Zoom webinars for public comment, but we did want to make sure to.
Now we welcome comments, and certainly if you don't type them in now and so that everybody can see them, please know that you can always submit things to staff through the website, and but those will be part of our permanent record made public.
Just have that information in.
Well, I am going to assume that everybody has all of their questions answered. There are no open comments. So with that, I think we'll let everybody get off to an early start to the weekend, and thank everyone for your participation. Thanks particularly to all of our speakers and to our staff who somehow make everything possible, and to the committee for your attention. So committee members, I guess we are regrouping on when? On the 1st, right? Tuesday. And you want to remind everybody of the time, Amy? I think it's 1 p.m. Eastern, because it's 11 where I am.
Yeah, and that's a closed deliberative session.
Yes, yes, that is a closed session. So again, thanks everyone. Enjoy your weekend, long weekend, and we will be meeting again soon. Bye-bye.
Much everyone.